There is a particular cruelty in having nothing left to lose, and a rarer mercy in giving anyway. When a stranger was found half dead in the lane beyond Nethercott, with no name on his lips and no memory of his own face, every prosperous door in the village turned its lock against him. The comfortable feared what a hunted man might cost them. But the poorest woman for miles, who owned little more than a cold hearth and a garden of weeds, knelt in the mud, took his frozen hand, and drew him inside. The people of Nethercott came to Tansy Orme only in the dark. They came when a child burned with a fever no prayer could cool, or when a lambing went wrong at midnight and the beast screamed in the straw. They came with their hoods pulled low so no neighbor would name them, and they left the same way, clutching her tinctures against their chests as though the little glass bottles might shame them in the daylight. By morning, they crossed the road to avoid her. It had always been so. Her mother had been the same before her, a wise woman the village needed and despised in equal measure, until the winter the fishmonger's boy died of a rot no herb on earth could have mended, and the whispers hardened into something with teeth. Witch, they had breathed at her mother's back. Tansy had been 9 years old, and she had learned the shape of that word before she learned to write her own. Now she was 23, and she lived alone at the very lip of the parish, where the good soil gave out and the ground turned soft and treacherous toward the mere. Her cottage was one room, a hearth that smoked, a roof that wept in the rain, and a garden that no one but she could read. To an idle eye, it was a tangle of weeds. To Tansy, it was an apothecary, every stem and root set down by her own hand, feverfew for the aching head, comfrey to knit a broken bone, willow bark steeped soft for pain, and nightshade kept locked in a box she never opened without counting her own fingers afterward. She knew what grew and what killed, and the narrow country between the two. It was the only wealth she had ever owned, and it did not fill her belly. That autumn had been lean past bearing. The tithe had taken what the blight had spared, and Tansy had learned again the old arithmetic of hunger. One meal made to answer for 2, a heel of black bread and a broth of whatever the hedges surrendered. She was thin in a way that no longer frightened her. She had buried both her parents and a brother, and she had kept the little house and her stubborn pride, and she told herself most nights that endurance was its own kind of victory, even when it tasted of nothing at all. Only the month before, the miller's wife had come scratching at her shutter past midnight, gray with a childbed fever that had already carried off 2 women in the Low Country that year. Tansy had sat with her until dawn, cooling her and dosing her and coaxing her back from the edge inch by stubborn inch. The woman had lived, and when Tansy passed the mill 3 days after, Corbin Snell the miller had spat into the road at the sight of her and warned his boys to keep the cunning woman clear of his sacks, lest she sour the flour with a look. That was the whole of her world. They needed her hands in the dark and cursed her face in the light, and she had long since stopped expecting the account to balance. The storm came down out of the north on the last evening of October. She had felt it building all day in the ache of her mother's old wrist, a thing she had inherited along with the cottage and the whispers. By dusk, the wind had turned to a low animal moaning in the chimney, and the first rain arrived not in drops, but in fistfuls, flung sideways against the shutters until the whole cottage seemed to flinch. Tansy banked the fire low to make the peat last, and sat close to it with a shawl doubled over her shoulders, listening to the weather try the door on its hinges. No living soul would be abroad on such a night. Even the desperate stayed home when the sky came apart like this. She had made her peace with nights like this a long while ago. There was no one left to worry after her, and no one who would come if she called out. And she had learned that a woman alone survived by wanting nothing the dark could take from her. She drew the shawl tighter and watched the fire eat itself down. So when she heard the sound, she was certain at first that she had imagined it. It came again beneath the wind, and this time she could not pretend. A horse. The wet scream of a horse somewhere out on the lane, and under it, fainter, the flat, heavy sound of something large going down into the mud. Tansy sat very still, her pulse loud in her own ears. Travelers did not come this way. The lane past her door led nowhere the respectable wished to go, only out across the soft ground and down to the black water. She waited, telling herself it was nothing, telling herself to let the dark keep its own business. Then came the knock. It wasn't a knock so much as a collapse, a great graceless weight falling against the boards of her door, once and then sliding down them. No voice followed it, no plea, no name, only the storm and that terrible sagging quiet, as though whatever had reached her threshold had spent the very last of itself to arrive there and had nothing left with which to ask. Tansy rose. Every hard-won instinct she owned told her to bar the door and wait for morning. She unlatched it instead. He lay folded against the base of the door like something the storm had chewed and cast away. A big man, made bigger by the sodden weight of his greatcoat, face down in the running mud with one arm flung up as though he had been reaching for the latch when the last of his strength went out of him. Tansy crouched and worked her hands under his shoulder and heaved. He did not stir. She was small, but a lifetime of hauling water and turning earth had put a wiry strength in her arms, and she braced her heels against the flagstone and dragged him over the threshold by degrees, cursing under her breath, until at last his boots cleared the door, and she could throw her weight against it and shut the night out. In the firelight, he was worse than she had feared. Blood had sheeted down the left side of his face from a wound above the temple and dried and run again, black and bright together. His lips had gone the color of deep cold. When she pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw, the beat she found was there, but wrong, too quick and too faint, like a thread pulled close to snapping. He was perhaps a handful of hours from death, and Tansy knew it the way she knew her own name. She did not think after that. She worked. She peeled the ruined coat from him and built the fire high, heedless now of the peat she was burning through. And she set water to heat and tore clean linen into strips. She washed the head wound clean and found the bone beneath it whole, only split skin over a hard swelling. She warmed stones at the hearth and packed them close about him under every blanket she owned. She chafed his cold hands between her own and worked warmed wine and willow past his lips, a drop at a time, and slowly, the awful gray drew back from his face, and his breathing found a deeper floor. Twice in the small hours his heart stumbled, and twice she bent close and breathed steady words against his ear that she did not quite believe herself, telling him to hold, telling him the dark was not worth the walking into, until the faltering beat gathered itself and went on. She had pulled souls back across that threshold before and lost more than she could count, and she knew the exact weight of what she was spending on a man whose name she would never be told. It was only then, wringing out the last of the bloodied cloths, that she truly looked at what she had pulled in from the storm. The greatcoat was mud to the collar, but the shirt beneath it was fine, finer than anything she had touched in her life, a linen so soft and so closely woven that it might have bought her cottage twice over. His hands, for all their cold, had never broken earth or hauled a rope, and when she loosened his collar to ease his breathing, her fingers met a chain at his throat, and on it a heavy ring of dark gold, cut with a device she did not know but understood at once was a family's, the kind of mark that opened doors she would never be suffered to knock upon. Tansy sat back on her heels, the ring cold in her palm, and felt the first true fear of the night settle into her. poor men were simply poor. But a man dressed as a peasant with a lord's ring hidden at his breast, beaten near to death, and left on the marsh road with no purse and no horse and no name, was a man that someone had wanted gone. And whoever wanted a man like this, dead, would not thank the woman who kept him breathing. A small sound turned her head. A face at the window, pale against the black glass. There and then, not. She was on her feet at once, her heart in her throat, but the storm gave her back only her own reflection and the wild dark beyond. Perhaps she had imagined it. She had imagined the horse at first. Perhaps she had not. Below her, the stranger's cracked lips moved. No name came, only a single broken word she could not catch. And then his hand closed hard around her wrist and held on, the way a man goes down, holding on to the thing nearest him, and would not let go. He woke as though surfacing from deep water, all at once, and gasping, and for one wild moment, he did not know the ceiling above him, or the smell of peat smoke and drying herbs, or the small dark shape of the woman rising quickly from the stool by the fire. He tried to sit. Pain drove a white spike through his skull and folded him back against the pallet with a groan. "Lie still." The woman's voice was low and even, the voice of someone long accustomed to being obeyed by the sick. A cool hand pressed flat against his chest. "You have a wound above your ear that should by rights have killed you. Open it, bleeding again, and I have not the wine to spare you twice." He lay still. He breathed. He turned her words over and found, to his slow horror, that while he understood every one of them, he could not find a single word of his own to set beside them. He reached back into himself for the ordinary furniture of a life, a name, a face, a house, a mother, and closed his hand on nothing at all. It was not like forgetting. Forgetting had edges. This was a clean and total dark, a room swept bare. "Who?" he began, and stopped, because the question he needed was not, "Who are you?" but "Who am I?" And he could not make himself say it aloud. The woman watched him with a still, measuring attention. Her eyes were the brown of turned earth, and there was nothing soft in them, and nothing cruel either, only a patient reckoning, as though he were a sum she had not yet finished adding. "You do not know," she said. It was not a question. "No." The word came out cracked. "I do not know my own name." He waited for her to laugh, or to draw back, or to look at him the way the whole world surely looked at a beaten man raving in a hovel. She did none of it. She only nodded slowly, as if he had confirmed something she had half suspected, and rose and brought him a cup of thin broth and held it steady while he drank, because his hands, he found, shook too badly to hold it himself. That shamed him more than the wound, that a woman with wrists like reeds should have to feed him like an infant. He had some sense, faint and formless, that he wasn't a man who was fed, that he was a man who gave orders and had them carried out. And yet, here he was, and here she was, and the broth was the finest thing he had ever tasted, and he could not have told her his own father's name to save his life. "You should not have taken me in," he said, when the cup was empty. He did not know where the certainty came from, only that it rose in him, black and sure. "I think I have carried something very dangerous to your door." Something flickered behind her eyes. She reached into her apron and set a thing down on the blanket by his hand, cold and heavy, gleaming dully in the firelight. A ring. Dark gold. A device cut deep into its face. A beast he did not know, rising on its hind legs. "I found this hidden at your throat," she said. "A poor man does not carry a lord's seal sewn against his skin. And a man who is merely lost does not get left for dead in the one lane in the parish where no honest soul would ever think to look." She folded her arms. So, you have brought danger to my door. I had worked that much out before you woke. The question you have not asked, and should, is why I opened it anyway." He looked at this strange, thin, unflinching woman, and he did not have the answer, and something in his ruined chest turned over. "Why did you?" he asked. "Because no one else would have," she said simply, and took the empty cup away. He slept again, and when he woke, the light had gone to the gray of afternoon, and the storm had worn itself down to a steady rain. The woman was at her table, grinding something in a stone bowl, and without turning she said, "You will need to be called something. I cannot go on thinking of you as the man I ought to have left in the mud." He almost smiled. He was surprised to find he still could. "Choose then. It seems I am in no position to argue." She considered him a long moment. "Win," she said at last. "It was my brother's name. He is dead. He will not mind the loan of it." "Win," he repeated, tasting the borrowed name in his empty mouth. It fit no better and no worse than any other word, since he had nothing of his own to set against it. "And you? Tansy. Orm. Though most in Nethercott would tell you to call me worse." He meant to answer, but a thing moved in the dark behind his eyes just then, quick and vicious, gone before he could seize it. Torchlight, a raised voice he almost knew, the cold certainty of hands upon him in the night. He came back to the little room with his heart slamming, and Tansy's steady gaze upon him. "What did you see?" she said quietly. "I do not know." But he knew one thing now, risen whole out of the swept dark. "Tansy, I do not think I fell out there. I think I was meant never to get up again." Tansy did not flinch. She had spent her whole life among people who wished her gone. She only set the bowl aside. "Then let them believe the marsh finished the work," she said. "Out here, a dead man is the safest kind to be." The fever came for him on the third night, as she had known it would. Tansy had tended enough broken heads to expect it, and she sat up with him, through the worst of it, while he burned and shook and argued with people who were not in the room. He spoke in his fever, the way he never did awake, and she learned more of the nameless man in those dark hours than he would willingly have told her in a year. He gave crisp orders to men he named only by their surnames. He spoke of a regiment, and of a river crossing gone wrong, and once, with a grief that stopped her hands, he begged some unnamed soul to forgive him. Twice he said a word that was almost a name, a hard, short sound, and each time his whole body flinched as though the word had teeth. By dawn the fever broke. He woke clear-eyed and weak as a new lamb, found her still beside him, and had the grace to look ashamed of the trouble he had been. "You talk a great deal. For a man with nothing to say," she told him, and folded a cup of willow tea into his hands, and he laughed, a rough, startled sound that seemed to surprise them both. After that, something eased between them. The days took on a shape. He healed with the stubborn speed of a strong man who has been hurt often and never once been let to enjoy the mending. Within a week he could sit, then stand, then cross the little room with one hand trailing the wall. He was younger than she had first judged, and harder used than his years could account for, his body written over with the pale record of old wounds. A soldier's body. Yet his hands, when they were steady, moved with the unthinking ease of a man who had never in his life wanted for a thing, and his voice, even worn thin, carried the flat certainty of one used to being minded. He did not fit himself. He was two men laid one upon the other, and neither of them could give her a name. Long before his body was truly ready, he took to mending things. A new tooth for her broken rake. The sullen chimney coaxed at last to draw. He argued the proper way to bank a fire, as though nations hung upon it. She fed him from a pot meant to last her alone until the year turned, and she watched the bottom of it, climb nearer every day, and she said nothing. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He was, whatever else, not a stupid man. "You are starving yourself for me," he said one gray afternoon, watching her tip the greater share into his bowl and the thinner into her own. "I have kept count. You eat half what you give me, and do twice the labor." "You are twice my size and knitting a hole in your skull," she said. "It is not sentiment. It is sums. It is charity you cannot afford, is what it is." He set the bowl down. The old exhaustion had gone out of his face, and something else had come into it, sharp and unresigned, the man beneath the man. "Tansy, we must speak plainly, you and I, for I think we are both people who prefer it. I cannot stay here eating the food from your mouth, and I cannot leave." "No," she agreed. "You cannot. You have no name, no coin, no horse, and somewhere a person who believes you dead and would be very sorry to be corrected. Walk into any town between here and the sea where that face is known, and you are a corpse by nightfall." He was quiet. "You have given this much thought." "I give everything much thought. It is why I am still breathing." She sat down across from him and gave him the whole of her attention, and he had the sudden sensation of being properly seen for the first time in a life he could not recall. "So, here is my thinking. You fear the man who tried to kill you will try again. But a man only hunts what he believes still runs. If your enemy is certain you are dead, drowned in the mere on a foul night with no body worth the dragging, then his hunting is finished. He has won. He can put on his blacks and mourn you handsomely and take whatever it was he wanted, and he will never once think to look for you here. Why would a dead lord be alive in a witch's hovel at the edge of the world?" She watched understanding move across his face. "You are proposing," he said slowly, "that I let myself die. I'm proposing that the man in the road already did. He drowned. Let him. What crawled out is a fellow called Wynne, who is no one, who owns nothing, whom no one wants, and no one will come seeking." She tilted her head. "The dead are not pursued. It is the one true safety I know of, and I am handing it to you for nothing." For a long moment he said nothing at all, and then, to her astonishment, the thing that crossed his face was not fear or grief, but something perilously near to relief. "You don't understand what you are offering me," he said quietly. "I have been remembering, in pieces, not who I am, but what it was to be him." He turned the borrowed ring in his fingers, the beast on its face catching the light. Every soul who ever came near that man wanted a thing from him. His favor, his name, his money, his land, his ruin. I cannot recall one single face that ever kept me alive and wanted nothing back. He looked up at her. "Until a woman with an empty pot hauled me out of a storm, gave me her dead brother's name and half of all she had, and asked me for not one thing." Tansy found she could not hold his gaze and looked into the fire instead. "I am not being kind," she said roughly. "You will earn it. When you are strong, you will cut the peat and mend the roof and carry the water. All the things my back can no longer do alone. You will be useful, or you will be gone." "Yes." There was the ghost of something in it, almost a smile. "I imagine I shall. I find I should like to be useful. I do not think I ever have been, in the whole of the life I cannot remember." He held out his scarred hand across the small space between them, palm up, a strangely formal gesture from a ragged man in a borrowed name. "Then we are agreed, Tansy Orm. The Lord is dead. Long live your hired man. I will keep your secret if you keep mine, which is only that I have none." She looked at his open hand. It had been a very long time since anyone had held anything out to her but the back of one. Slowly she laid her small, rough palm against it. "Agreed," she said. And for one moment, in the smoky little room at the edge of the drowned world, neither of them was alone. That night, though, the past came for him again. He woke in the black with his own cry still in his ears, and her hand hard on his shoulder. The dream was already fraying, the way they did, but this time it left more behind than terror. This time it left a face. "A man," he said, before he had decided to speak. He stared at the low red coals and held the image before it could dissolve. "There was a man, younger than me, fair, where I am dark." He was laughing. His hand had closed around the ring without his willing it. He called me brother. And then the laughing stopped, and he watched them do it to me. He stood in the torchlight with his hands folded behind his back, and he watched, and his face never changed at all. "A brother," Tansy said softly. "I do not know if he was my blood or only my heart, but he knew me. He knew me well enough to be sure I would come when he called, alone on a filthy night, to a place where a man might simply vanish." He pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes. "Whoever I was, I loved someone who wanted me in the ground, and I cannot even give you his name to curse." Tansy was quiet a long moment. Then she reached out and, very deliberately, closed his cold fingers tighter around the ring and folded her own hand over his fist. Then, "We will not curse him yet," she said. "We will keep you dead, and we will keep you breathing, and one day, when you are strong and your name has come home to you, we will decide together what is owed. Sleep now. The dead have nothing to fear from the dark. It might have held that fragile peace had the world let it." But 3 mornings later, Tansy came up from the mere with the water yoke across her shoulders and found old Widow Pauling waiting at the turn of the lane, breathless with the particular joy of dreadful news. "They are dragging the low water past Sedge Cross," the old woman said, eyes glittering. "Grand men, horses, a steward in livery, asking in every house from here to the coast. Some great lord thrown in the storm and lost, and a purse of gold, Tansy, a purse of gold for any soul who brings word of him, living or dead." Tansy kept her face very still, the way she had learned to keep it under the word witch. "A purse of gold," she said. "And how far is Sedge Cross?" "Half a day, no more. They will come to Nethercot by week's end, mark me. Every door of it. Every door. Including the one at the edge of the parish, where a dead man sat mending by the fire and did not yet know that his own funeral had come looking for him. For 2 days the village did not come, and the waiting was a torment all its own. Wynne wanted to run. Tansy would not hear of it. "A strange man seen fleeing the marsh is worth more to them than gold," she said. "You will stay. You will be my dead brother's simple cousin, come to see me through the winter, slow of speech and slower of wit, and you will let me do the talking. For I have been lying to this village about one thing or another since before you had a face worth naming." He did not like it. He did it anyway. He was learning that her plans had the unlovely solidity of things that work. It was not the steward who came first. It was a child. He came pounding at the door in the black before dawn, a barefoot boy of perhaps 8 years, so wild with fright he could scarcely shape the words. Tansy was up and reaching for her satchel before Wynne had fully woken. "It is the miller's youngest," the boy gasped. "The little maid! She cannot breathe! She has gone blue at the lip! My mother says come. She says please. She says she is sorry for all of it. Only please come." Tansy was already dragging her cloak about her shoulders. Wynne saw her hesitate a single instant, one flick of her eyes toward him, toward the open cottage, toward the road and its danger. Then the hesitation was gone, burned off by something older and harder than fear. "Stay here," she told him, low and fierce. "Bar the door. Whatever you hear, you don't open it." "Tansy." He caught her wrist. "The miller. The man who spits in the road at you, and you would run into his house in the dark." She looked at his hand on her arm, and then at his face. "The child did not spit at me," she said. "Bar the door." And she was gone into the dark with the boy, and Wynne stood alone in the cold, with his heart in his mouth, and understood, all at once and wholly, that he would pull the world down before he let harm come to her, and that he did not so much as know his own name to swear it by. She was gone, until the light came gray in the shutters. He did not bar the door. He stood behind it the whole night with the fire iron in his fist, listening to the wind and to every far cry the marsh threw up. And he learned that hour by hour what a slow murder waiting is. He did not know this cottage, and yet in a handful of days it had become the only place in a nameless world that felt like his. He knew the creak of the third floorboard and the exact set of her jaw when she was afraid and hiding it. He knew that the small brown bottles on the high shelf were ranked by their danger, gentlest to deadliest, left to right, and that she never once had to look to find the one she wanted. He knew nothing of himself and everything of her, and the unfairness of that sat on his chest all night like a stone. When at last he heard her step on the path, he had the door open before she reached it. She came in gray to the lips with weariness and sat down hard on the stool and stared at the fire, and for a long while she said nothing at all. "The child?" he asked. "Lives." Her voice was scraped to the bone. "It was the croup, the strangling kind. Another hour and she would have been past me." She turned her hands over in her lap, those small, chapped, clever hands, as though she did not quite know what to do with them now the work was done. I opened her throat to the steam, and I dosed her, and I breathed for her when she could not. And near dawn the seal of it broke, and she pulled a whole breath, and the whole house wept. She did not tell him the rest, how the miller's wife had clung to her skirts, how the older children had watched her with the round, grave eyes they kept for the parson, how for the length of one gray hour the meanest house in Nethercott had treated her as something holy and not something to be burned. A strange, bitter wonder crossed her face. Corbin Snell went down on his knees on his own floor before me. The man who used to say the parish had been too gentle with my mother by half. He took my hand and pressed a coin into it and called me a gift of God. She opened her fist. On her palm lay a single silver shilling, more than the miller had ever paid her, more than an apology, and nothing at all beside what it had cost her to earn. Tomorrow he will cross the road from me again. I know it. They always do. In daylight I will be the witch once more, and it will be as though this night never was. She looked up, and her eyes were wet and furious, and wholly without self-pity. But for 1 hour, in the dark, that man knew exactly what I am. Wynne crossed the room. He had not known he meant to. He knelt down in front of her, as the miller had knelt, and took her cold hands in both of his. The shilling caught warm between their palms, and looked at this fierce, starving woman, who saved the lives of people who loathed her and asked nothing and expected less. "They are fools," he said, very low, "every last one of them, to be handed a thing so rare, and to see only something to be frightened of." His thumb moved slowly over her knuckles. "I cannot remember my own name, Tansy Orme, but I know I have crossed a great deal of the world, and I do not believe I have met one soul in it worth the half of you. Her breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved, her hands in his, the fire low, the whole ruined night gone still around that one quiet point. And then, far off but clear in the dawn hush, came the sound that turned them both to stone. Hoofbeats on the marsh road, many horses, moving at a walk, unhurried, certain, the way men ride who believe they have all the time in the world and the law at their backs. The steward had come to Nethercott. They did not come to her door first. Tansy had counted on that. The steward and his riders went to the heart of Nethercott, to the church and the mill and the alehouse, where a man with gold to spend could buy the most talk for the least trouble. She had the whole of a long morning to make ready, and she used every minute of it. She was not the only one who used it. She had scarcely got Wynne drilled in his part when a heavy tread came up the path, and she opened the door, with her heart in her mouth, to find Corbin Snell standing there, twisting his hat in his big flower-white hands and looking anywhere but at her face. "They are asking after a stranger," the miller said gruffly. "In the alehouse. Gold, for word of a hurt man taken in off the storm." He worked the hat. I said nothing. "Whatever you are keeping up here, mistress, it is no business of mine, and a man who owes you his youngest does not sell your secrets for a purse. But Nell Pauling has a long tongue and a short memory for kindness, and she has already told them the witch took in a great slow cousin a fortnight past. So they will come. I could not stop that. I came to tell you they will come." He jammed the hat on his head. "That is all." And he was gone down the path before she could find a word, having paid, in his rough and graceless way, a debt she had never thought to see honored. By the time the knock came, then, there was no sick lord in her cottage. There was only her simple cousin, a big slow man in her dead brother's coat, sitting hunched on a stool by the fire, whittling clumsily at a scrap of kindling and humming tunelessly to himself. Wynne had a gift for it that unsettled her. He had made himself small, folded all that unthinking authority down out of sight, and become a man no eye would rest on twice. Only she could see what it cost him, the tightness at the corner of his jaw, the too careful stillness of a soldier holding his fire. The steward filled her doorway without asking leave to enter. He was a lean gray man, with a clerk's stoop and a hunter's eyes, and the badge stitched at his breast bore a beast rising on its hind legs, dark against pale cloth. Tansy did not let her gaze snag upon it. She had seen it already, cut into a ring that sat hidden beneath a loose board, not 3 strides from the steward's boot. "They tell me in the village," the steward said, "that the cunning woman took in a stranger out of the storm. A big man, a hurt man." "They tell you true," Tansy said, and did not have to feign the weariness in it. "My cousin came to me half drowned off the coast road a fortnight past, robbed of his horse and his purse, and near his life by footpads on the heath. If you have come to return any of the 3, he will thank you. If you have come to take my last living kin as well, you may join the long queue of those who have already taken everything else I had." The steward's eyes went to Wynne. Wynne looked up slowly, blinked at the fine stranger with a dull, amiable confusion, touched his forehead in a clumsy salute, and bent back to his whittling. "Cousin," the steward repeated. "Coombe, on my mother's side. Simple, since a fever took him as a boy, but strong, and mine, and no lord's lost gentleman, if that is what your gold is hunting." She let a hard edge come into her voice. "We do not grow lords out here, Master Steward. Lords do not soil their boots on the road to Nethercott. Whatever grand man you have mislaid, he did not mislay himself in my mud." For a long, terrible moment, the steward studied Wynne. His gaze moved over the whittling hands, the bent shoulders, the coat gone short at the wrist, and Tansy stood in the middle of the small room and let 10 years of practiced stillness hold her face, while her heart tried to climb out of her chest. Then the steward spoke to Wynne. He spoke in French. It was quick and soft, a murmured aside built to trip any man who understood it. Tansy's blood went to water. She knew the sound of French from grand folk passing on the coast road, and not one word of its meaning, and she could not have answered it to save either of their lives. Wynne looked at the steward with the same slack, patient bafflement he might have turned upon a barking dog, and said nothing at all. The steward's eyes thinned. He tried again, sharper, a whip crack of a sentence. Wynne scratched his ear. Something in the gray face closed. Whatever snare he had laid, the empty stare had walked through it exactly as a simpleton would. For a slow man cannot pretend not to know a tongue he never had. The steward straightened, but at the door he paused and looked back, not at Wynne now but at Tansy, and his voice when it came was gentle and almost kind, which was worse than any threat. "My master grieves for his lost kinsman most tenderly," he said. "The young lord took the blow so hard he has scarcely left his rooms, yet he rides out with us tomorrow to see the ground himself, for he will not rest until his dear cousin is found and laid to rest as befits so great a name." He let it settle in the smoke. "A rare and loving grief. In 30 years I never saw its equal." And then he was gone, his riders with him, the sound of them draining away toward Sedge Cross. Tansy sat down on the stool with her legs gone to reeds. Across from her, Wynne had not moved, but the amiable dullness had drained out of him like color from a dying face, and what was left was white and wide awake and terrible. "Wynne?" "He grieves," Wynne said, very low. He was staring at nothing. So tenderly. "He has scarcely left his rooms." He raised his eyes to her, and they were not the eyes of any slow cousin. "That is him, Tansy, the fair man from the torchlight, the one who called me brother, and stood with his hands behind his back and watched. He has taken my death, and worn it before the world like a mourning coat, and now he rides out to be sure of the body." His hands had begun, very slightly, to shake. And think on it! A man certain of a death does not drag every ditch in the county. He's afraid. He is afraid I crawled out of that water, and he is coming here to make certain I did not. The fire popped. Out on the marsh a curlew cried, thin and lost. "Then we have until tomorrow," Tansy said, and reached across the small space between them and closed her hand hard over his to still its shaking. And it was she now who held him steady, as he had once held on to her wrist in the dark, and would not let go. They did not sleep that night. There was no sense in it. Tansy moved about the cottage with the flat calm she wore in a sick room when a life was going out, packing what little could be carried. And Wynne sat by the fire turning the ring over and over in his scarred hands. And the memory that had been coming back to him in pieces for a fortnight chose that long, dark to come back whole. It did not come gently. It came like the tide over low ground, all at once, drowning. He remembered the house first, not its name, that door stayed shut, but the shape of it, a great pale sprawl of a place with too many rooms and too few voices in them, and a gallery of painted faces he had spent his boyhood being measured against and found wanting. He remembered his father's cough and his father's coffin. He remembered the weight that had come down on his shoulders the day they slid the ring onto his hand, the endless ledgers and tenants and men who bowed to his face and weighed his purse behind his back. He remembered being always alone in the middle of a crowd. And he remembered the fair boy. "He was my cousin," Wynne said into the dark, and Tansy stopped her packing and came to sit near him, saying nothing, only there. "Orphaned young. My father took him in, and I was glad of it. God help me, because it meant I was one child less alone. I taught him to ride. I paid his debts twice over and never told a soul. I called him brother because I had none, and wanted one so badly I made one out of a man who was only ever measuring the distance between what he had and what was mine. His voice was steady. That was the worst of it, she thought. He told it the way a clerk reads out a bill. There is no direct heir after me. I never married. There was never the time and never anyone. And so the whole of my house and my name and my lands falls to him the day I die without a son. His hand closed wide around the ring. He did the arithmetic I had never troubled to. He wrote to me in a hand I trusted and begged me come alone and quietly to help him out of some private shame, because that was the manner of fool I was, the kind who would ride out on a filthy night to spare a brother's pride. They were waiting on the marsh road, and he stood in the torchlight with his hands behind his back so they should not be dirtied, and he watched them set upon me and tip me into the water, and his face never changed at all. He drew a slow breath, and he has not been idle since. I remember the shape of what waits for me now. Within the month, they will stand him up before the law and name him the 5th Duke, and the moment they do, everything I ever held becomes his to keep or sell or burn. My tenants, my father's people, the old servants who dandled us both as boys. He will turn out every soul who ever loved me too well to be safe. I have seen him do smaller cruelties for smaller reasons. Given the whole of my name to hide behind, he will be a quiet horror for 40 years, and the world will call him your grace and think him gently made. The fire had burned to a low red seam. Tansy reached out and took his hand, the one crushed bloodless around the ring, and did not let go. I remember all of it now, Wynne said. The house, the cousin, the men, my own blood black in the cold water. I remember the whole of the life they tried to end. He turned to her at last, and there was something broken open in his face that no fever had ever put there. All of it but the one thing, my name. I reach for my own name, and there is still only the swept dark, as though that is the single thing they truly managed to kill. A terrible ghost of a laugh. I am a duke, Tansy. I am all but certain I am a duke, and I cannot tell you what they should carve on my own stone. And here it was, the thing she had been bracing against since the moment her fingers first closed on a lord's ring at a beggar's throat. He was no nameless stray. He was one of the great ones, the kind whose shadow lay across whole counties, the kind who would no more truly see a woman like her than he would study the mud on his own boot. She had known it from the first. She had let herself forget it these soft, strange days, and now the knowing was back, and it lay between them like a drawn sword on the blankets. She took her hand from his. "Then you must go back and take it up," she said, and made her voice hard, because hard was the only shape that would bear weight. "When it is safe. You must go back to your great pale house, and your ledgers, and your name when it comes home to you, and be what you were made. And you must forget this place, and the witch who kept you, for a duke cannot be beholden to a cunning woman off the marsh, and it will do you nothing but harm to be remembered here. Tansy, I am telling you how things are. I am good at how things are. It is the one thing I have ever been good at. Tansy." He caught her face in both his hands, gently, the very way she had cradled his broken skull the night she saved it, and made her look at him. "Do you know what you were doing while I lay dying in your doorway? You were kneeling in the mud no duke would soil his boot upon, giving the last of your own warmth to a man who could not so much as thank you with a name. There was no lord out there and no witch. There was a soul going down into the dark, and a soul that would not let it go. His thumbs moved over her cheekbones. I have been bowed to by 1,000 people who despised me. I would give the whole shining lot of them for 1 hour of being kept alive by someone who wanted nothing back. Do not you dare stand in your own house and tell me you are beneath me. You are the finest thing I have found, in the whole of a life. I am only sorry I cannot yet remember to be ashamed of. And she who never wept, who had buried a mother and a father and a brother, dry-eyed, because grief was a luxury of people with time to spare, felt her whole face break, and Wynne drew her in against him and held her while she shook, and did not once, not for a heartbeat, hold her as though she were fragile, or beneath him, or anything at all but his. When she lifted her face, he kissed her. It wasn't a lord's idle kiss, and not a rescue, and not a payment. It was slow and certain, and a little desperate, the kiss of a man who had stood alone in the middle of every crowd his whole life, and had found, in the poorest room in England, the one place he was not. She rose into it. The drawn sword did not vanish, but for that long moment it was laid down and forgotten, and neither of them reached for it. When they drew apart, his forehead rested against hers, and his breathing was unsteady, and his eyes, when they opened, had gone from broken to something forged. "Hear me," he said, very low. "I'm going to remember my name. And when I do, I am not going to run from it and hide in the dark, and leave him to keep what he killed me for. I am going to walk back into the light wearing it, and take every last thing of mine out of his hands. And the first use I make of the whole of it, Tansy Orme, is going to be to stand between you and every soul who ever taught you to flinch." It should have warmed her. Instead, a cold finger traced her spine, for she had heard the steward, too, and she knew the thing he had not troubled to say. "Wynne." She gripped his wrists. "He is not waiting for you to come into the light. He is riding into the dark to find you first, and he comes at dawn. They should have run. Any sensible creature runs from a great man with horses and the law folded in his pocket, and Tansy Orme had made a whole life out of being sensible. They did not run. There was nowhere to run to, for one thing. But it was more than that, and they both knew it. Sitting close by the banked fire through the last dark hours, with the packed bundles they were not going to carry sitting useless by the door. A hunted man might run all his days. He might reach some far gray port and take a false name, and grow old, glancing over his shoulder. And the fair cousin would keep the house and the lands and the meaning of the ring, and would sleep sound every night of that long life on the strength of a murder no one had lived to name. "I have run from nothing I can remember," Wynne said. "I do not think I shall begin with this." "No," Tansy said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt him go still, and then his arm came around her, careful, as though she might yet bolt. "No, we stand." Outside, the wind had dropped. The storm season was turning, and beneath the marsh cold there was the faintest green smell of a spring neither of them had any right to expect to see. They sat and watched the fire, and did not speak of dukes or cousins or the reckoning to come, and for a few stolen hours the drowned little cottage at the world's edge held the only thing Tansy had ever truly wanted, and never once dared give a name to, which was simply this: someone beside her in the dark who would not leave and did not wish to. Let us pause here just a moment. If a story like this one has found its way to you, and you would not want the next to slip past unseen, take a breath and follow the channel before we go on to see how the dawn breaks over Nethercot. She must have slept, in the end, her cheek against the rough wool of the borrowed coat. What woke her was not a sound, but the ceasing of one, the marsh going all at once watchful and still, the way a whole wood hushes when the hawk's shadow slides across it, Then, on the hard dawn air, the ring of iron-shod hooves on the causeway. Not many horses now. One, walking. A single rider, unhurried, coming up the lane that led nowhere but to her door, as though he had always known the way. Wynne was on his feet, and his face in the gray light was the face the torchlight had remembered, awake at last to the last of it. "He has come himself," he said. He rode into her yard on a tall gray horse, as though he were riding into his own courtyard, and swung down into the mud he had all his life been too fine to touch, and Tansy saw at once that Wynne had told her true. He was beautiful. That was the horror of it. Fair and slender and elegant, with a face made for a mother's pride and a painter's flattery, and he stood in the filth outside a witch's hovel in a coat worth more than the whole of Nethercot, and glanced about him with mild, pleasant interest, as though he had come to look over a horse he might or might not buy. Wynne had stepped out to meet him. Tansy stood in the doorway at his back, the cold iron of the fire poker laid along her forearm and hidden in the folds of her skirt. For a long moment, the two men only looked at one another, the fair and the dark, and the fair one's pleasant smile did not slip, but something moved far back in his eyes, something that had not slept in a fortnight. "I had very nearly let myself believe it," the fair man said at last, softly, almost wondering. "The steward swore blind the fellow was a simpleton, swore you had no French." A small, exquisite shake of the head. "You always were a better soldier than I ever gave you leave to be, even drowned, even witless. Here you stand." "Here I stand," Wynne agreed. "Do you even know who you are, cousin? They tell me your wits went into the water with the rest of you." The fair man took a soft step nearer, gentle, almost tender, the way a man approaches a hurt beast he means to put down. "Let me help you to it. It is the least I owe you, after everything we were to one another. You are His Grace Everard, 4th Duke of Ashcombe. You are my own dear brother in all but blood, and you have been so very, very ill." And there it was. The name went through him like the tide going out, and every door in the swept dark blew wide at once. Everard. He was Everard. He heard it in his father's voice and his mother's, and in the mouths of 1,000 people who had ever wanted a thing from it. And last of all, he heard it now in the soft, caressing voice of the man who had stood in the torchlight and watched him die. And the hearing burned off the last of the fog, and left him standing whole in the cold dawn, himself entire, remembering all of it. "Yes," said Everard, Duke of Ashcombe, and his voice had changed. It had stopped being Wynne's. "I am Everard. Thank you, Crispin. I had all but lost it. It seems the one thing you could not take was the last thing you would ever have thought to guard." The fair man went very still. Behind him, up the lane, came the sound of the rest of them, the steward and the riders, drawn on by their master, spilling into the yard and reining up in a steam of blowing horses. And behind them, and among them, the village, for a great gray horse and armed men on the marsh road at dawn will empty a hamlet faster than a fire bell. Corbin Snell was there in his flour-dusted apron, Widow Pauling, the alewife, the smith, a score of wind-chapped faces that had crossed the road to be quit of Tansy Orme her whole life long, come now to see what the witch had drawn down upon them all. Crispin saw them, and Tansy watched the beautiful face make its swift, clever reckoning, and change its shape. "Thank God you good people have come," Crispin cried, wheeling to the crowd, and his voice broke on a grief so flawless that Tansy's own traitor heart lurched to hear it. "You are witness, all of you. This poor, ruined madman is the last cruelty of a wicked woman. My cousin the Duke drowned on your marsh, 3 weeks gone, God assoil him. And this creature, this cunning woman, you have all feared, and rightly, has stripped his very corpse of its ring, and dressed some passing vagrant in a dead man's memory, to cheat his grieving house of everything it holds. He flung a trembling hand at Tansy. She has bewitched this broken soul into the belief that he is a great lord, risen from the water. Look at him. Look at her. You know what she is. You have always known what she is. And the terrible thing, the thing that stopped the breath in Tansy's chest, was the sound the crowd gave back. A low, wavering murmur, and threaded through it the old word, the word with teeth, going from mouth to mouth. Witch. Witch. She saw them begin to shrink from her and to close upon one another, the way a flock wheels from a falling shadow. And 10 years of every turned back and crossed road rose up in her at once and told her exactly how this ended. It had always ended the same way for women like her mother. He is right that you know what I am, Tansy heard herself say, and her voice did not shake, for she had spent a lifetime learning to keep it from shaking. I am the woman who sat up with your fevers. I am the woman who opened the miller's daughter's throat, but 2 nights passed, and breathed for her until the dawn. You know precisely what I am. The only question before you, good people, is whether you know the first thing about what he is. Enough. Everard did not shout it. He said it the way, she thought, he must once have said it across a field of battle, and it fell over the yard, and the murmuring died, as though a hand had been laid across every mouth at once. He stepped forward, and though he wore a dead man's borrowed coat and a fortnight's beard and the gray of a long sickness, something came off him, now that had not been there a breath before, some old, unbending weight that made the fine mounted men shift in their saddles without knowing why they did. Colvin, he said. The steward flinched, as though struck across the face. You served my father before you served me. You knew my hand, and my seal, and my voice for 30 years. Everard lifted his own hand, and on it now, slipped onto his own hand, while every eye was upon Crispin, sat the dark gold ring, the rampant beast catching the gray light. You spoke to me in French at this woman's fire yesterday to spring your trap, and I let you believe it had shut on a fool because I was not yet ready to be found. Look at me now, Colvin. Tell these people whether I am a vagrant. Tell them whose voice this is. And then reckon very carefully, as a man who helped roll a living duke into the mere, whose word the assizes will believe, now that the duke is standing in the daylight to give it. The silence stretched to the very edge of breaking, and Colvin, gray to the lips, came down off his horse and onto his knees in the mud, and said in a cracked whisper that carried to every ear in the yard, Your Grace, forgive me. It is him, as God shall judge me, it is him, and it was Lord Crispin's own order that night, and I have not slept a whole night since. The murmur of the crowd changed its shape entirely. For one instant the mask came clean off the beautiful face, and Tansy saw at last the thing that had been living behind it, cold and old and starving. It was always going to be yours, Crispin said to Everard, quite calmly, quite low, as though the two of them stood alone. Every acre, every soul, the very name. I ate at your table for 20 years and watched it all fall on you like rain, who never once wanted a drop of it. And I thought, only let me have a little. Only let me have what he is too careless even to hold. He smiled, and it was ghastly. I should have made certain of the water. Then he moved. He lunged, not at Everard, but at her, faster than thought. For Crispin was clever to the very last, and knew that the surest road into a man is through whatever he cannot bear to lose. Tansy saw the fine gloved hands reaching to seize her, and had time to think, with a strange flat calm, that it was a poor bargain for the parish to lose its healer at last on the very morning it learned it had wronged her. She never saw Everard move. She only felt him, a wall of borrowed wool and old soldier's muscle flinging itself between them, catching his cousin's outstretched wrists a hand's breadth from her and turning him about as though he weighed nothing at all. And then Corbin Snell and the smith and 3 other broad marshmen who had spat in the road at her for years were dragging the beautiful fair lord down into the mud he had never in his life deigned to touch, and it was done. It was Corbin Snell who set his knee in the small of Crispin's back to hold him. "You'll not touch her," the miller said, to the fine lord thrashing in the muck beneath him, loud enough for the whole village to hear it and remember. "She saved my girl. Whatever else this parish has been to her, and it has been a poor sort of friend, I will tell you what it will not be, and that is a place where a great man lays his hands on the woman who kept his own duke alive." Tansy stood in her doorway, her back pressed to the frame, and looked out at a yard full of people who had feared her all her life, and found every last one of them, for the first time she could remember, standing between her and the danger instead of on the far side of the road from it. Everard straightened and turned, and looked at them all, the mounted men and the marsh folk and the miller kneeling on his fine cousin in the mud, and when he spoke, his voice carried to the last soul at the back of the yard. "Hear me, and carry it to every house from here to the coast. This woman is Tansy Orme, and from this morning until the day I die, she is under the hand of the Duke of Ashcombe. She found me dying and nameless and worth nothing to any living creature, and she gave me back my life and asked me for none of it. Whatever debt this parish ever fancied she owed, it is paid tenfold and over. And any man who raises so much as a hard word against her from this day raises it against me." He let it settle over the yard like the cold, clean light. "Do you understand me?" They understood him. She stood in her broken doorway and watched them understand. They took Crispin away in his own fine carriage, bound with the steward's own belt, and the rider's went with him, no longer his. Colvin rode at their head with the gray face of a man riding toward his reckoning, and half grateful for it. The yard emptied slowly. The villagers drifted back toward their houses in 2s and 3s, casting looks over their shoulders at the witch's cottage that were not, for the first time in Tansy's whole life, the looks she knew how to read. She could not have said what had come into them instead. She had never had the practice. And then it was only the 2 of them again, as it had been, standing in the churned mud, with the pale sun coming up cold and clean over the mere, and the whole shape of the world lay changed between them. He was a duke. He stood there in her dead brother's short coat, and he was his grace, the Duke of Ashcombe, master of a great pale house, and more land than she could walk the bounds of in a week, and the borrowed name had fallen off him in the yard and would never fit his shoulders again. So Tansy did the sensible thing. She began, quietly, to let him go. "You will want your horse seen to," she said, to the mud between them. "And you will want to be at your own house before the news outruns you, or that carriage will carry the wrong tale to your door before the right one can follow. You should go today. I will give you bread for the road. It is poor stuff, but it is honest, which is more than you have had at your own table, I think." She made herself say the rest of it evenly. "You owe me nothing for the keeping of you. You paid it in peat and water, like an honest man, and the account is square. You may forget Nethercott with a clear conscience. It will manage to forget you. Tansy. I am good at how things are, she said, fiercely, still to the ground. Do not make me be bad at it now, when I have only just got you set back to how things are meant to be. Look at me. Please. And because he said please, which no duke on this earth ever needed to say, she looked up. He had drawn the ring from his hand. He held it out to her, on his open palm. The dark gold, the rampant beast, the whole weight of his ruined and recovered life sitting there in the cold light. Do you know what you did? He said quietly. The night you hauled me out of the storm? You found a man with no name lying at your door, and rather than let him lie there being no one, you gave him one. You gave him your own dead brother's name, the most precious thing a poor woman owns, and you asked him for nothing at all. His hand did not waver. I have my own name back now. It cost a great deal, and I am not wholly certain it was worth the getting. But there is one thing I can do with it that Crispin could never take and never touch, and it is the only thing I have ever owned that I have wanted to give away rather than guard. He stepped closer. You named me when I had nothing, Tansy Orm. Now let me give you mine. She stared at the ring, and then at his face, and her practiced hardness cracked clean down the middle. You cannot, she whispered. A duke and a cunning woman off the marsh. They will never bow to me. They will laugh at you in every drawing room from here to London. I will be the ruin of you. I have nothing, Everard. A cottage that leaks, a garden of weeds, and a name this whole parish has spat upon since before I could walk. It was the first time she had spoken the name to him. She saw it strike home, saw what it did to a man who had heard that word in 1,000 mouths that wanted something of it, and never once, in all his life, in a mouth that wanted only him. Say it again, he said, rough. Everard. They will bow, he said. I give you my word, they will bow, and I mean to enjoy every stiff and grudging neck of it. But that is not why I am asking, and you know that it is not. He closed the last of the distance and took her face in both his hands, as he had that first broken night. I do not want a duchess who came into the world knowing which fork to lift. I have met 100 of those, and never once wanted one past the second dance. I want the woman with the empty pot who knelt in the mud for a stranger who could give her nothing. I want to sit by a fire the rest of my life beside the one soul on this earth who ever kept me alive and asked for not one thing in return. Marry me. Not to be saved, for you have never in your life needed saving, and I think you would clout me if I said you did. Marry me because I was no one at your door, and you are the woman who taught me that being no one was the truest and best thing I have ever been. And Tansy Orm, who had wanted nothing all her life because wanting was a luxury meant for people the dark could not reach, discovered that she wanted this so fiercely it frightened her more than any word with teeth ever had. She looked past him, once, at the low green tangle of her garden, at the soft ground running down to the silver water, at the leaning stones under the far hedge where her own dead slept. She had never once thought to leave them. She was not sure, even now, that she could. I will not be buried away from them, she said unsteadily. My mother, my brother, I will not go and be a grand lady in a far country and leave them out here alone in the cold with no one to tend the ground. Then we will not leave them, Everard said simply. The house at Ashcombe has more rooms than it has ever had souls to fill them, and I have hated every empty one since I was a boy. But it is a poor sort of duke who cannot keep 2 houses. This one is yours. It will stay yours. We will come back to it, and you will tend your dead and your garden, and I will mend, whatever the winter breaks. and the Marsh will see a great deal more of its Duchess than any drawing room in London would think seemly. The corner of his mouth turned. I find I no longer care in the least what a drawing room thinks seemly. He took her left hand, the small one, chapped and scarred and clever, and slid the dark gold ring onto her finger, where it hung loose as a shackle struck off rather than one put on. Yes, said Tansy. God help the pair of us, yes. They were not married in a cathedral. Everard offered it, half laughing. The great church at Ashcombe, with the bishop, and the painted windows, and the whole staring county packed into the pews, and Tansy told him she would as soon be wed at the bottom of the mere. So they were married instead, in the small grey church at the edge of Nethercot, the one with the weeping roof and the leaning stones, on a bright, hard morning at the very turn of the year. Tansy did not wear silk. She wore a good plain gown of deep russet wool, warm and well made, and her own, and about her throat on a length of ribbon she wore the dark gold ring. For a hand that had hauled water and buried its own dead all its life did not care to be hampered by so much as an ounce of gold, while there was still work left in the world to do. The whole village came. They had not so much been invited as found themselves unable to stay away, and they stood in the cold in their Sunday wool and watched the woman they had crossed the road from for a lifetime take the Duke of Ashcombe for a husband. And when the old vicar named her a duchess, Corbin Snell wept openly into his hat, and not one soul present thought the worse of him for it. The news went out from Nethercot the way floodwater goes out over low ground, quiet and then everywhere at once, into every parlor and print shop in the land. It was not a scandal in the end. It was a marvel no one quite knew how to tell. The great Duke of Ashcombe, given up for drowned, risen out of a marsh grave to see his own murdering heir taken in chains, and to wed the poor healer who had kept him breathing. The drawing rooms could not decide whether to be appalled or enchanted, and so, in the way of drawing rooms, they compromised upon being consumed with curiosity, and by spring there was not a hostess in London who would not have parted with her own teeth to seat the Marsh Duchess at the head of her table. Crispin was tried at the assizes, where Colvin's testimony and a dead man standing hale in the witness box left the jury very little to trouble over. He was not put to death in the end. Everard, to the astonishment of many and the private understanding of exactly one, spared his life, and had him shipped instead to the far hot side of the world, to a distant colony from which gentlemen of ruined name did not come home. A quick death is an hour, Everard said, when she asked him why he had spared it. I would rather he had a great long while yet to sit and consider that the only person who ever loved him without wanting a thing was the man he put into the water. Tansy thought that was either the most merciful thing she had ever heard, or the most pitiless, and after turning it over a while decided it was somehow both at once, and loved him the more for it. They did not live only in the great pale house. They lived in it, to be sure, for a duke has business that will not be conducted from 2 rooms on a marsh, and Tansy learned its long, cold galleries, and in time made them warmer than they had been in 100 years. But she would not be a healer turned ornament. She physicked the Ashcombe tenants, as she had physicked Nethercot, and word went round the 3 counties that the new duchess would come out in the worst of the night for a cottager's child, as readily as for a lord's, and would take no coin she was not owed, and the country people, who know the true worth of a thing long before the drawing rooms do, loved her for it, with a fierceness that never faded. And a great many mornings still found the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe not in any gilded hall at all, but in a small stone cottage at the very edge of the world, its roof at last made sound, its door standing open to the green breath of the marsh in spring, she at her herbs, and he at some honest mending, arguing without heat over the proper way to bank a fire. It was there, on such a morning, that she found him standing in the garden with the ring in his hand, turning it in the light as he had once turned it 100 times in the dark. "Do you know," he said, when she came to stand at his side, "I spent the whole of my life certain that this was the most valuable thing I owned." He looked out over the mere, flat and silver and harmless now, that had so nearly been his grave. A lie about who I was very nearly held me under that water for good. The truth of who I was could not swim a single stroke to save itself. It was the poorest woman for miles, with nothing to gain and everything in the world to lose, who reached down into the storm and pulled me out and asked me for not one thing. He closed his scarred hand over the gold. The cruelest night of my life carried me to the one door in England that would open to me. I have long since stopped being sorry it happened. I am only sorry it took a crack on the skull and the loss of my own name to bring me somewhere I was wanted, for nothing but myself. Tansy leaned her head against his shoulder, as she had that last dark night before the world came riding for them, and felt his arm come round her, no longer careful, no longer braced against her bolting. "You talk a great deal," she said, "for a man who once had nothing at all to say." He laughed, the deep, unguarded sound she had first startled out of him over a cup of willow tea in a freezing room, and drew her in. And above the silver water, the marsh birds went up bright and wheeling into the clean spring air. The worst night of their lives had left a nameless man dying on the poorest doorstep in the parish, and out of that one small mercy, given by a woman who had every reason in the world to keep her door shut, and opened it anyway, the two people that everyone had thrown away had built the one thing neither had ever dared to ask for, and no storm that came to Nethercot after ever again found that door barred against it.